Welcome everyone to the collaborative webinar on the Artificial Intelligence Juggernaut in Healthcare and Life Sciences, brought to you by the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs and the George Washington University Commercialization Department. And today we're going to talk about how artificial intelligence affects us in life science and healthcare. And whether or not domain knowledge and entrepreneurial spirit funding can really make a meaningful, positive impact in the lives of our patients. We thank our sponsors, the Institute of Electronics and Electrical Engineers, as well as SOPE and the George Washington University, and Greenberg Traurig, who is a local sponsor of the DC chapter of SOPE. And during COVID, we have halted our in-person events, which should hopefully start up sometime late this fall. And please look at our website, www.soapnet.org, to look to see if there is a local SOAP chapter in your area. If there's not, please feel free to contact me and we can start one. Next slide. So we have a great array of panelists and presenters here today. Let me first introduce Brian Koblitz, the Senior Licensing Manager at the George Washington University Commercialization Department. Brian, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Lauren, can you hit the next slide, please? As Jeff mentioned, I work at the GW Technology Commercialization Office. We manage all the inventions coming out of George Washington University, from their birth to their death, evaluating technologies, protecting their IP, and then working to find and partner with companies to bring them to the market and make an impact in our society. And my focus personally is on the medical side and healthcare. And I'm really excited to hear from this experienced panel that we brought to you today on AI. And if you weren't able to join us on our series of webinars over the last year on startup pitching, I think you'll really benefit from those as well. So take a look for those on our YouTube channel, or feel free to contact us to learn more. So our job here is to connect technology, people, and money, and this is the type of event that is great for doing that. So we're pleased to be a part of it. Lauren, can you hit the next slide, please? Another way that we are working to make those connections is through this virtual network, GW CAN, Commercialization Advising Network. You are all invited to participate. This is a place that's very easy to go and ask for specific help that you need as you're commercializing, and or provide some assistance to people who have such questions. We're starting to get some traction here, and I've had some really good connections made just over the last week or two. I have a small company that we got connected to, a very entrepreneurial cardiologist here at GW. Looking for more of the same, come be a part of it, no obligations. Next, please. Just wanted to provide a little background relevant to the topic for the day. There's quite a lot of activity at GW. Couldn't get it all here as far as AI and machine learning, but these are some highlights for you to give you an idea of the depth and breadth. Here at GW, the biocompute object maybe needs a little explanation. This is a collaboration with FDA, pharma, to create a means of providing big data studies and results as you make your FDA submission in a way that's going to be reproducible and readily evaluatable for others. So this is a large project that hopefully will make your regulatory pathway simpler and in a way that will provide more value to you as others can reproduce the results. Other topics involve trying to prevent healthcare impacts during driving, using machine learning to look at health records for a number of reasons, including heart failure risk factors, and then also improving the triage process. So with that, I'd like to throw back to Jeff so that we can begin.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to GW. I have been a assistant clinical professor there for decades, and it is a great institution with terrific professors and great learning opportunities. So we're first going to start off with Ari Shen. Ari is a fractional executive, is how he introduces himself. He hails from Southern California, is involved in many entrepreneurial activities, is also involved in the SOPE chapter in Orange County. And Ari, it's a pleasure to have you here today. I know you've helped us collate these panelists to talk about how AI in healthcare is more hope than hype.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate the opportunity that you reached out, and as a SOPE ambassador in Southern California, putting together this panel. In addition, it's funny because I realized that there's a convergence, from, at least from my perspective, of several areas. So IEEE is a close to heart organization. I've been on the executive team or committee of IEEE in Orange County for the last 6 years. I chaired and co-chaired Cybersecurity Society and others. Mainly these days helping with expanding of the membership and organization reach. Also related to Brian, nice background in terms of tech transfer. So for the last 8 or so years, I've been running one of the fractional activities that I have is running a company that provides IP research for tech transfers and law firms across the country. And we've been working, fortunate enough, we were established 14 years ago. We've been working with about 50 marquee name university tech transfer all the way from Hawaii to the East Coast and anything in between. And to name some names, you know, Stanford, UC, UC in general, Rutgers, Cleveland Clinic, and other places where innovation and entrepreneurship pops up. And so that's also a very close to my heart. You know, autumn is a place that I spend quite a bit of my time and so on. Anyways, per Jeff's request, I think that I managed to, I don't know, beg, steal, and seduce my good friends, Karina Raisin, Jan Bermaier, and Neil Sahota to come and join for this hour and to share from their wealth of information in terms of AI in different approaches. I think that what I try to do is give the audience an angle from 3 different locations and understanding and exposure for AI. And I hope that you'll enjoy that discussion and panel. So I suggest that we will go in the following order. We'll start with Neil Sahota, then with Karina Raisin, and finishing with Jan Bermaier. And I'll ask each one of them to introduce themselves and take the presentation. So Neil, the baton is yours. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Ari, and good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be in the world. I'm very excited to be here. I will get straight to the content, so I'll just be very quick with my intro. I am the co-founder of the United Nations AI for Good initiative, and I actually serve as their AI advisor. I helped pioneer this entire AI wave we're currently in about 20 years ago. And I was part of the original IBM Watson team, did the Jeopardy Challenge. It was very much one of the champions to try and get the technology in the hands of domain experts, business experts. So that's why I wrote my book, Oh, the AI Revolution, to empower, enable, and educate non-technical business leaders. But enough about me, let's talk about some fun stuff. So when it comes to AI, I know there's a lot of hype, but there's actually a lot of power there that we sometimes overlook. So I want to play a quick little video snippet for you, because one of the eternal questions has been, can AI create? So my buddy Ross Goodwin set out to see, could an AI create an original film script? Well, I'm going to play you a little news video to see what happened.
All right, you can't tell me that.
Yeah, I was coming to that thing.
I don't want to be honest with you.
You don't have to be a doctor.
I'm not sure. I don't know what you're talking about. I just wanted to tell you that I was much better than he did. him. I didn't want to hurt him. Sorry, I don't like him. I don't love him.
So if you actually want to see the film, it's actually completely posted to YouTube. The question becomes, can Benjamin actually create art? Well, it wrote this original film script, but the answer is no. AI can only do what we train it to do. We've not found a way to teach creativity or imagination. But anything we can commoditize, we can teach. And you may have heard the expression, data is the new oil. Well, we live in a world where there's massive amounts of data. And in the case of Benjamin, it turns out that looking at all the movie data, every movie ever made fits into one of 12 archetypes. And so Ross realized that if I teach Benjamin the 12 archetypes, a little bit about dialogue and characters, it actually will have the ability to write original film script like Sunspring. That's actually how this works. And this is really the power of AI, is to comb through this vast array of information and look for those hidden dot connections that we can't easily see. That's why actually AI is such a powerful tool for us. Think about all the data we're just generating sitting here right now, watching this webinar, right? In addition to us being IP logging and recorded, and our machines and operating systems, we're wearing devices that give GIS location information. If you're wearing like a Fitbit or some other health device, it's recording things maybe about our heartbeat, how many steps, all these things. So there's a vast array of data to tap into. In healthcare, well, there's a ton of data, a ton of complex information challenges where AI is assisting, clinicians, doctors, nurses, researchers. And one good example of this is something I worked on where a few years ago, a woman in Japan fell ill. Went out and saw her doctor of like 20 years, tried a few things, nothing seemed to work, started seeing specialists, they ran tests. But about 7 months into it, they couldn't quite figure out what was going wrong. And so when the doctor says, hey, let's see if IBM Watson can actually help out, right? They've taught Watson a lot about healthcare. So we came in, we gave Watson all the great work all the doctors had done, gave Watson her genomic sequencing. Watson asked a couple of questions and then basically concluded that she has 2 rare forms of leukemia. Now, in all honesty, everyone's like, whoa, well, that really seems hard to believe, but we'll test for it. Well, she tested positive for both forms. Now the doctors knew what was actually wrong. We're actually able to put her on a proper treatment plan. So that's the power of these AI tools in healthcare. Take 20 million studies, condense it into something that has an eidetic memory, something that's more than just a generic search engine. It's something that can actually try and answer questions that we don't have the answers to. And that's the power that we have, but we still have a challenge when it comes to AI. And the challenge is actually on us as people, because we're used to computers being about automation, doing something faster, cheaper, less errors, right? It follows a program or sequence of steps that we actually program. Well, AI is called the 3rd generation of computing. It works differently, it has whole new capabilities. You don't really do much programming for an AI. Everyone talks about algorithms. Well, because of neural networks, the AI is actually creating its own algorithms. It's figuring out how to try and solve these problems based on rule sets on how to make decisions, what we call the ground truth. And if we understand that and shift our own mode of thinking, we can actually unlock innovation and change processes and systems by finding a new way to perform the work. Now, what does this really mean to, right? What is innovation? Well, I'm actually going to take us back to the 1870s for a moment and talk about the invention of the movie camera. Now, if you're not familiar with the story, it actually started with Leland Stanford, the guy that started Stanford University. He made a bet for a lot of money back then, saying that when a horse gallops, when it runs, all 4 hooves can be off the ground. Of course, the other guy said one hoof always has to be on the ground. Well, for Leland to win that bet, he needed proof. And he went to a scientist named Edouard Moudet, explained the bet to him, and Edward thought about it and said, okay, I think I have an experiment that will get you the proof. So they went out to a field, set up 100 cameras, and had one person man each camera, and then a horse gallop by. And so the cameras went off in succession, 1 second after the other. So they wound up with a stack of 100 photos. They're flipping through it. Leland finds a photo with all 4 hooves off the ground. It's like, yes, win my bet, runs off to collect the money. Edward, however, was looking at the photos. And he's like, when I flip through it, it's like I have all these still images, but somehow they're moving when I flip through it. Invents the film camera and pioneers the whole movie industry as a result. How is it that 2 guys with the same objective come up with such radically different conclusions? Well, Leland was focused on winning his bet. So he treated each one of those photos as an independent data point, right? He just wanted to find the one data point that wins him the bet. Because Edward didn't make the bet, he could actually look at the data in aggregate and see that special insight along the relationship between those 100 photos, those 100 data points. That's the power when it comes to AI. We're not talking about 100 data points. We're talking like 100 million data points. So we know there's some of these hidden connections, that things that even we understand, these flags or indicators, some of them maybe is coincidental, and maybe things that we haven't actually noticed, that the connection is too subtle. This is where AI really comes into play. And I'm going to play another video. There's not much sound here, so don't worry about that. But watch what the gentleman is doing and watch what happens with that robotic arm. You can see that somehow he's controlling the arm with his mind. This isn't Elon Musk's Neuralink. They didn't drill a hole in his head and put a chip to try and decode his brainwaves using AI. This is where the power of AI gets unlocked. It's the partnership between the domain experts and the technologists. Doctors and clinicians know that if you're born without a limb or you lose it, the brain can still send signals to the stump. But that actually triggers a process. So rather than trying to decode our brain waves, we can look at the process through our body that triggers the motion. What they realized is part of that is muscle and tendon movement. So if you look above his right elbow, you'll see a black band. That's an IoT sensor array. And it's designed to pick up that muscle tendon motion, which AI has learned to decode. So based on that, the coding based on the movement, it then translates that motion into the robotic arm. Meaning that thanks to AI and robotics, you can actually restore mobility to people that may have lost a limb. And a lot easier than drilling a hole in our brains. Now, there's a ton of work going on in AI and healthcare. I'm sure a lot of our audience knows some of this stuff, but China is actually invested a lot and made a lot of data available for AI. And that's why in some regards in healthcare, they're very much leading the way. So I'm going to play you another video news clip showing some of the work that they're actually doing.
At Shenzhen No. 6 People's Hospital, Dr. Cheng Chunsheng is conducting a gastroscopy for a patient. During the procedure, dozens of images are being taken of the esophagus to look for cancer. Esophageal cancer is one of the deadliest cancers in China. Usually, the accuracy of the diagnosis relies on the doctor's personal experience and skill. This is where an AI system becomes quite helpful.
For example, we have 50 images. The AI system will analyze them all and select 5 pictures showing a high possibility of cancer. Then I check the selected images directly to make a final diagnosis. It's faster and more efficient.
The system is called Miying, developed by Chinese internet giant Tencent. Its database comes from cancer diagnosis information from first-class hospitals in China. Since its trial use began in June 2017, it has served 400,000 patients.
We established a joint program with Tencent to provide necessary data. Now the accuracy of early detection of esophageal cancer has reached 90%, roughly the same level of diagnosis made by human doctors.
This is one of the first hospitals in China to put such an intelligent system under pilot trial for clinical testing. Last November, China announced its plan to build a national platform for AI diagnostic medical imaging.
Developers say they are trying to enlarge the system's database and expand its coverage in China.
AI is able to learn from lots of data. That's what humans can't do. We hope the system can reach out to remote areas and grassroots hospitals in China, where patients can get a diagnosis as accurate as in first-class hospitals in big cities.
So far, the system has been used for detection of esophageal and lung cancer, as well as diabetes. It's expected to cover the 10 deadliest cancers in China in the future. He Weiwei, CGTN, Shenzhen.
That was a little flavor of what they're doing, but you can see that they're using AI to actually improve quality of care. So they talked about, some of the rural hospitals may not have access to the tools and the talent and some of the resources, and they're using AI to actually prop up the level of care to that of like a big city hospital. So that's a good example of how we can democratize more of healthcare, but also take advantage of these new capabilities, innovation. And another area where AI is being used a lot is actually in mental health. So, before the pandemic and probably even during now the pandemic has become a bigger problem, the biggest illness in the world is actually loneliness. I know that pre-pandemic, about 40% of the world suffered from moderate to severe loneliness. And so you actually have a lot of work with people using AI. Like there's a project in Nairobi, Kenya called Loving AI, where they're trying to teach an AI system unconditional love to give people that are lonely or are feeling depression an outlet. So not a replacement for human relationship, but an outlet, a safe space where they can actually engage, feel like they can connect and belong, build up some confidence, get the help they might need. They can actually go out, connect with people, and overcome some of the loneliness. So there's a ton of work going on as a result in mental health using AI technology. And this is really just scratching the surface, right? Unfortunately, we only have a little time together here, but across the board, you look all the way from patient to physician, every step along the way in the healthcare process, the quality of care, there's actually something going on with AI. It's an accelerant, but it's also a new way, a new process or system to actually help improve diagnosis and treatment, quality of care, patient engagement, oncology. I won't bore you with the entire list, but this is the opportunity that most people are trying to seize right now. And one thing on top of that is they're marrying AI with other emerging technologies and other processes. There's a lot of stuff going on with extended reality and virtual reality and blockchain and all these things, but one of the big things is actually around generative design. And that's where you let the AI come up with millions of design options. So you teach it how something works, like a car or a plane, and then you give it parameters on how to build something. And what happens is it'll actually generate millions of designs and actually even fabricate materials that people have never made before, but could, and roll that down to the top 7 to 12 designs for human engineers to review and see which one might have the most merit. And a real world example of this is the work I did with, again, IBM Watson and Local Motors, where we went to Watson, taught a little bit about transportation and said, can you design us a multi-passenger vehicle that is eco-friendly and low cost? And of all the design options, one of them was Ollie, which actually got constructed, which is a self-driving, it's an autonomous driving, solar-powered 3D printable bus that can carry 12 people. So this is honestly not something that we probably would have ever thought of on our own and tap into that potential. And we can extend this actually into healthcare. And unfortunately, in a bit of irony here, 4 years ago, I actually proposed using AI and generative design to teach a system about viruses. So using generative design, the AI could actually try and figure out what mutations may occur and what new viruses may emerge. And since we know the genetic structure, something that looked like it might be probable, we could actually start working on a vaccine in the hope that we could actually prevent epidemics, let alone pandemics. Unfortunately, at the time, it was estimated to cost maybe around $40 billion. And of course, a tremendous amount of resources and top scientists and doctors that are working on life-saving things. And so the decision was made not to pursue it. Of course, ironically, with COVID-19, looking back, that hindsight might have been a mistake, considering that I think last I saw $19 trillion of global wealth has been wiped out. And of course, all the sufferings, the deaths that we've experienced. So, but this is unfortunately a great example of where we could have tapped into AI to actually help prevent disease in the first place. I know what you're thinking. How do I do this? Well, the secret sauce is you do have to think differently. We've got to learn to move away from automation and get into innovation. We have to learn a little bit. We don't have to become technologists necessarily. We have to learn the capabilities of AI and marry that with the understand the problems of our domains. So you think about healthcare, we need the doctors and the nurses, the clinicians, all these people come in, sharing what's going on and the problems and seeing where the capabilities can actually help us. So that was my little wine tasting into AI and health. And with that, I will actually flip it over to Karina.
Thank you, Neil. So while I share my presentation, just a little bit about background. So first of all, again, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's a pleasure being here and presenting a little bit on the high level about AI in healthcare and life sciences. By background, I'm a technology executive with extensive experience in this field. I work in big companies and entrepreneurial environments, bringing transformational medical devices into the market, and now currently working on same transformational technologies, which includes AI applications and elements. Currently, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Tesseract Health. It's a company that is developing state-of-the-art technology with enable cutting-edge AI capabilities, which I'll talk and I'll give an example of this company, what we are doing in that area. But also, beside my industrial efforts, I keep in touch with academia. I'm an entrepreneur in residence for UCLA, where I work closely with their researchers to help guide and bolster the entrepreneurial efforts within the campus. With that, so Neil gave a very nice presentation on some of the aspects that AI is currently used in healthcare. We have from management as an industry healthcare, but also the actual applications as related to R&D efforts, which some of the things that he mentioned, how we care for patients, like efforts of mental health, how we use AI to assist robotic surgery, but also robotics arms and things like that. And I think the most common one is the use of AI for medical imaging and diagnostics, which is the example he brought from China. So just go briefly for each one of these applications. So again, healthcare is an industry by itself. As an industry by itself, it has to manage profitable industry. So they use AI for marketing, pricing, operations, customer services, and fraud detection has became a big thing lately, given all the ransom requests that hospitals are getting lately. But again, these are not specific for healthcare, but healthcare is adopting all these AI applications as part of the industry. More related to healthcare per se. So the first application is, of course, the patient care. We talk about automation and assisting in the diagnosing and prescription through mobile apps, chatbots, and things like that. We also help for auditing prescription, given the abundance of what's called IoMT, which is Internet of Medical Things. We help monitoring different aspects of the patient care. A very good example, which is very popular, is pregnancy management today. And he also mentioned in case of prioritization on triage that is used in hospitals, precision medicine, which is essentially customize or tailor the medical treatment to the individual based on their health history, on the race, on the age of all the different characteristics of each patient. And of course, help with patient data analytics. This helps a lot during clinical research. Some of the applications that Neil talked about, the patient with the leukemia. But again, this is a lot of information that without AI cannot be analyzed properly. The next area for applications of AI is, we mentioned, is the robotic surgery. So as you know, robotics don't get tired, which for long surgeries, this is a problem. But more importantly, what AI can identify is during these surgical procedures is how best to use the surgical equipment, and also through image processing and AI algorithms, accurately do surgical procedures which are very precise in the sub-millimeter precision. So this is also a very hot area within medical devices on the applications of AI for precise surgery. The other one that Neil also mentioned is for R&D purposes. Mainly, it's used today for drug discovery and gene analysis. Those are things that I mentioned to accelerate the research of new drugs, to have a better understanding of the genes and their components. This is something that drug companies took a long time, can significantly accelerate those efforts and test different drugs even before even they go into any type of clinical studies. But the one that it's most used today, and one of the examples from China that Neil showed, is for early diagnosis of diseases using medical imaging and diagnostics. And I would like to take this area of AI applications to give you a little more flavor of what the company I work for, Tesseract Health, is doing. So recent advances in AI have enabled accurate prediction of person's blood pressure, diabetic risk, smoking history, Alzheimer's progression, and heart attacks by just peering into the human eye. And why is that? Well, the retina of the eye, it's a place where it's essentially the only place in the body where you can directly visualize arteries, veins, capillaries, and nerves. And therefore, the retina of the eye, it's a portable window, not just to the brain of the patient, not just for ocular diseases, but also to the brain and the rest of the body. There are a lot of research that they're using retina imaging for as a novel diagnostic platform, and the reason is, again, you don't only use this information, the rich information that is in the retina for ocular diseases, which are well known, but also for cardiovascular, infectious diseases, inflammatory, neurology, and non-invasive blood tests. So essentially to replace blood draw with an ophthalmic imaging. A lot of efforts are in Alzheimer, for example, in cardiovascular predicting severe risk, in strokes. And there are more and more efforts on using imaging of the retina for detection of COVID, and as well as different metabolic diseases. So what is Tesseract doing? So Tesseract, the mission of Tesseract is essentially to democratize healthcare and improve life by using the wealth of health information in the human eye. As I mentioned before, there is a lot of information in the retina that you cannot find in other place in the body, which will have that richness of data. So we are developing a portable, affordable, it's a multimodal retina imager, which is AI enabled for screening and telehealth. So essentially, the patient will image their eyes, and there will be AI applications that will run on the images to help the diagnosis or the detection or the risk assessment of early stages of the different diseases. In this area, which uses image of the retina for diagnosis of different images, as say before, there is a lot of research in these areas, and actually it's created a new field within the research called Oculomics, which is to identify ocular biomarkers for different systematic diseases. For example, this publication from 2020 talks about using biomarkers or the Oculomics for mortality, morbidity and mortality of cardiovascular disease and dementia. This is another example of using one image, one single fundus image, which is a two-dimensional image of the back of the retina, of the back of the eye, to predict cardiovascular risk factors. I'm sure that physicians within the audience are using fundus images today for detection of diabetic retinopathy. There is no more need for the patient to go per se to the optometrist to diagnose these early stages diseases, but as they go to a routine exam to their general practitioner, by taking a fundus image and an AI algorithm, they can do a risk assessment of early diabetic retinopathy and be able to refer the patient to the specialist. But this doesn't come free. There are a lot of challenges and hurdles to implement AI in healthcare. One of the biggest one, which Neil also mentioned, is you need high volumes of data. But it's not just that you need high volume, because the algorithm will do is as good as you train it. So the high volume of data is not just by numbers, but it's also by quality of the data that you provide to the algorithm and you use for the algorithm. Everyone is familiar with garbage in, garbage out principle, which is if you don't train your algorithm with high quality, relevant, and reliable data, you are in risk of predicting the wrong diagnosis, which is, as you can imagine, very critical in healthcare. The other thing that also is very important is bias in algorithms. So for example, if the data that was used to train these algorithms were from Caucasian patients, right? So that doesn't mean that for other ethnicities, the level of accuracy will be as good as for Caucasian patients. And this is something that FDA is very worried, and that's why FDA is very restricted on the type of data that not only is used for train this algorithm, but also to verify and validate these algorithms. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of images. So the second portion that it's a challenge for AI is the security and privacy of patient data, because a company that develops a AI algorithm, because of the high volume of data that they need, it's very hard to collect the data from data sets or data banks, because usually these days, you don't know how they receive the data. The hospital, if the patients did not sign consent forms that the data can be used for other purposes, then there are some legal aspects that we need to go through to be able to receive that data. Even if it's HIPAA compliance and everything that is from the private security considerations. The third one is, of course, the regulatory requirements. FDA is learning with the industry how to regulate AI applications. They are all considered today, most of them, they are considered de novo because they are unique. But again, for example, FDA is challenged by how you have a machine learning algorithm deploy, meaning an algorithm that learns the data, and as it learns the data, update the algorithms. So FDA does not allow to do that right now, because that means that the learning portion was not verified and validated, and therefore there is a risk associated by doing that. So FDA is working very closely with the industry to find a way to put quality systems in place to be able to do that moving forward. And as I said before, the hurdle of the data that we need to collect, the high volume, the quality of the data, the diversity of the data, that requires significant clinical studies, which is it's a long-term thing that we need to do, but also it's very costly for a company, especially for entrepreneurial startups. The second thing is, the next thing is essentially producing the right decision at the right, the point of care. And that goes to the sensitivity and specificity of these algorithms, which some of that also Neil touched. You need 99% to be, sensitivity and specificity to make sure that you make the right decision. Otherwise, if your diagnostic is incorrect, it can be catastrophic result associated with that. Now, let's get into more the use of AI. So in different healthcare settings, AI is, while it's very promising, it requires a lot of infrastructure, cost, reimbursement, and other logistics that these healthcare settings needs to take care of it, which is very costly for them to be able to implement, especially now that they're the numbers of AI applications in medical or in healthcare for this type of application is still very low. So for them to spend a high cost for putting these things together, it's taking longer and longer for them to do that. The last two things I want to mention is that there is a reluctance from physicians to adopt some of these AI because they think they are going to be replaced by robots, which is not the intent. As Neil mentioned before, there is a significant difference between AI application and robots. But also when, these AI applications should not the benefit that it should bring is not just to be able to diagnose the same thing as the physician diagnose, but also to augment the intelligence for the physician, to provide them significant additional tools so they can do a more precise, not just diagnosis, but also treatment for their patients. And there are a lot of ethical concerns associated about the patient. Does he know that she knows that an AI algorithm is essentially diagnosing them? There is this face-to-face with the physician. Should they ask for a second opinion? There are a lot of other ethical concerns related to the applications of AI in healthcare. And I think with that, given the time we have, I'll pass it to Jan.
All right, thank you very much. Looks like my gardener's just left, so I hope you can actually hear me. So my name is Jan Bermaier. I've been coding since I'm 4 years old. I've now more than 20 years of experience in applied and theoretical AI. 10 years of that was spent in robotics, self-driving cars, drones, soccer robots. But the last 10 years, the majority of it was actually spent in healthcare. So I figured I'll talk a little bit about some of the startups I've helped with, I was involved in. Currently, Ari is a fractional executive. I'm the fractional technical executive, but I also mentor a lot of first-time founders since in my first startup, I did a lot of things wrong. I didn't have the right mentors, so I'm trying to help others prevent doing the same ones. In the US, if you tell the doctor that you think you might be depressed, they have to fill out a questionnaire like this one, the PHQ-9. Then they might give you some prescription or something else, and then they file the document. And the next time you do the same document, and if you talk to psychiatrists, psychologists, they will tell you that often they have a lot of problems actually trying to find, trying to look at the progress of the condition over time. And a lot of them actually tell you that they don't even know if medication is effective. There's just no way of tracking. So we did a lot of things wrong from the startup side in the startup, but the thing we did right is actually gathering the data. Often these days when someone says, I need AI for my problem, I actually often ask them, do they really need AI? And often I actually spent a lot of my time on the first half here of just helping people collect data, clean data, digitize data, organize data. And just by having the data and visualizing it, a lot of problems that people actually try to hire me for can be solved. Once you actually need the data, need to be able to understand it, then you can actually think about predicting stuff out of your data or even prescribing treatments. So whenever you think you need AI, just try to remember this chart and think about, do I just really maybe need the stuff on the left side, or do I actually really need some fancy AI? One example we did in combination with TEDx was refugee mental health. If you look at refugee camps, it's a horrible situation. People have no water, no food, but somehow everybody has a cell phone. And we worked with a camp where there were almost 100,000 people and one psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist asked us, like, how should he prioritize his time? And we built him a system where every day everybody would get a text that says, you're okay. And depending on the answer, we would send follow-up answers and track people over time, and then try to help the psychiatrist to optimize his time. It's still 1 versus 100,000, so there's only so much you can do, but we could help prioritize him where he should spend his time. My second startup, if you have an iPhone, some of this is in your pocket right now. The example was, this is 10 years ago, if you want to get a heart transplant in Cedars-Sinai here in Los Angeles, one of the best places in the world to do so, you have to see up to 25 doctors, but only like 5 of them were able to exchange their health information electronically. So we set out to get all the data out of EMRs before they had to export it. And we had to use AI to actually merge the data, because if you just look at name, last name, surname, just merging names is hard. And then if you go into any medical conditions, it doesn't get easier. We used AI to collect the data, gather the data, visualize it. And then once we had that, if you think back about this chart, we were actually able to look at population health. And there was a state where they had a huge obesity rate and almost half of their budget was going towards that population. And they had asked questions from politicians how effective their programs to address this is. And they were actually able to answer this with our software in seconds, instead of what normally used to take them half a year. I did some work in medical billing transparency. I think as a European, it's kind of shocking that you don't know at all how much you will pay at the end of your hospital visit. It can be free, it can be a 6-figure bill. So there's new regulation that requires hospitals to publish, like I think 99 or 199 services, the rack rate and how much different insurances pay. So we collected all this data and built a portal for systems for patients where they could actually shop, where they could correlate quality of care versus expected cost. Because if you might save 10 figures, 5 figures, you might actually want to drive a couple miles further instead of just going to the next hospital. I'm actually working currently with 2 companies on pre-approval. I think one of the most shocking things for me was when I first met my dentist in San Francisco, and she had 2.5 FTEs working on insurance pre-approval and then actually getting the money they were promised up front, and only half an FTE for scheduling for just one doctor. I can't say too much yet what we're doing here, but I think that's a space where there's lots of opportunities where you can use AI. I think I want to talk a little bit more is about a startup I'm actively involved in digital eye strain. You just saw Karina talk about the external device to monitor your eyes. This actually uses normal webcam built into your laptop to monitor your eyes. Dry eye, myopia, and digital eye strain also has back, neck pain and headaches. There's also devices that use external devices to do this, but we're actually able to use internal webcam to monitor patients and coach them to better behavior. Pre-pandemic, 1 in 3 children already had symptoms of digital eye strain and myopia. There's no official numbers yet, but it's estimated it almost doubled during the pandemic. I've seen kindergartners do their classes on Zoom, and then in their breaks, look at an iPad this close. So there's an interesting area to work on. And from the startups I've done in healthcare, I think these are the key things you need. There's lots of other things you need, but obviously you need a good idea. Without that, it won't work. You need deep healthcare expertise. Also, regulatory is in here. For instance, I did not know for my first few startups that once a patient donates the data, HIPAA no longer applies, which makes your life easier. Obviously, you need some AI expertise. Funding, you need the data that we talked about, but also timing. My first startup on mental health, even if we had done everything else right, the timing wasn't right. People were not interested in at the time for product commercialization. So I think actually doing it today would have a different outcome. All right, I have 1 minute left. So that's it. If you have any questions, please find me on LinkedIn and I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. So thank you to all of the presenters so far. I'd like to introduce you to Charles Andrus. Charles is a partner at the Greenberg Traurig law firm and heads up their division in intellectual property for healthcare and life sciences. And Charlie, I'm going to start by reading you something that I just received, and it was written by a gentleman, Carrie Ross. It says, machine learning, a subset of AI driving billions of dollars of investment in the field of medicine, is facing a credibility crisis. An ever-growing list of papers rely on limited or low-quality data, fail to specify their training approach and statistical methods, and don't test whether they'll work for people from different races, genders, ages, or geographics. The biggest problem points to machine learning's catch-22. There are few large, diverse sets to train and validate a new tool on. Many of those who do this are kept confidential for legal and business purposes. But that means that outside researchers have no data to turn to test the paper's claims or compare it to a similar work, a key step in vetting any scientific research. The failure to test AI models on data from different sources, a process known as external validation, is common in studies published on preprint servers and leading medical journals. So there are a lot of variables, and Charlie is the guy that we go to ask us, can we do this without getting into trouble? And how do we do this so that we can maintain our intellectual property? Charlie, can you give us your insights as to how they tackle this problem in dealing with AI applications?
Wow, that's quite a mouthful, Jeff.
Thank you.
So I think, you know, in my mind, maybe an initial point and then 4 distinct points, right? Any sort of AI basically is going to have this combination of 1 or more classifiers, and you're going to need a robust data set. And the more robust the data set and the better the classifier, ultimately the better the outcome that you're going to get, which is, I think, is a shorthand way of saying some of what this gentleman you were quoting said. But at the outset, there's kind of 2 differences in AI, right? There's one path where AI is used to do something like diagnose. There is another path where AI actually invents something. And I think one of the earlier presenters had a slide on design. Where AI is used to diagnose, both of these have issues in terms of patentability. But where it's used to diagnose, you don't have an inventor issue. Where it's used to actually invent something, you do have an inventor issue, because the patent offices in the United States and Europe have said that AI cannot be an inventor. And so the first thing to think about is which type of AI are you using? And if you're running into the second type where the AI is actually inventing something, then you need to think about, you know, how you're going to write claims around that in such a way that you don't end up having the AI itself be the inventor, because otherwise you get into all sorts of problems. But the second thing, Jeff, and these are intertwined, is that the standard to get a patent is lower than the standard to get through the FDA, whether you're going for pre-market approval, which is the highest standard, or de novo, which is kind of the next one down, or maybe a 510(k) clearance. So to get a patent, you just kind of need to show that it works at some level. To get through the FDA, you need to show a little bit more. But the upshot is that really ultimately you want to kind of lean towards the FDA standard, because even if you get a patent, if you can't get whatever you're doing through the FDA, then you can't market it. And so it doesn't really matter that you have the patent. And so the regulatory pathway and the patent pathway are sort of intertwined in that way. And your patent strategy should really map onto your regulatory pathway. Third thing is, let's take the example of some AI that diagnoses breast cancer, right? You have to meet the statutory requirements of novelty, non-obviousness, and also patent subject matter eligibility. And so if you invent a piece of AI that is more accurate at diagnosing, say, breast cancer than like a standard human medical professional, then maybe you meet the standard of non-obviousness because you have a result that's superior and perhaps unexpected. But then you have all these steps, and they can't be mental steps, because otherwise that's not really going to help you with novelty. So you have to kind of convert those into something that's done algorithmically on a computer in some way. And then the degree to which you're able to do that and the way you write those either allows you to get patent subject matter eligibility or not. And usually that's the biggest hurdle. It used to be, Jeff, that patent subject matter eligibility was a very narrow thing, very low bar. Most people easily traversed it. But a few years ago, the Supreme Court decided to step in and expand their thoughts on patent subject matter eligibility and raise the bar. And so they've said if you have a correlation or if you have an abstract idea, these are laws of nature, and in and of themselves, they're not patentable. And so you can imagine if you have a diagnostic, which is a correlation, and your diagnostic is using an algorithm, which is an abstract idea, you kind of have to sort of doubly traverse the Supreme Court's objections to be able to get to the point where you actually get a patent to issue. And so it requires kind of a good knowledge of the law. It requires creative drafting, but it's probably in the US the most important thing to watch out for. And the other issue that goes with that is because the US is so different, you may end up with different claim scopes out of the same application in Europe versus the US. And so whatever your marketing strategy is, you may need to take that into account.
So thank you,
Charlie. You were talking a lot about claims and strategy there in the patent office. I was wondering if you are using machine learning where your diagnostic, let's say, is improving over time as you get more data. How do you decide when to file and what claims to file with which algorithm when it's changing?
So I think there are different models for that, Brian. It's a good question. One model is kind of like, what is the base underlying algorithm, right? And you generally want to file on that because whatever else you're going to do is going to be kind of additions or small changes to that. And so if you file relatively broadly, you kind of give yourself sort of an initial zone of coverage. And then I think beyond that, because patents are expensive, probably each little small change in and of itself may not warrant a filing. But when you accumulate enough of them, or when you come across one that makes a significant difference, like maybe your accuracy jumps by 3 or 4% because you made this change, those kinds of situations would warrant like a second or a third filing.
And for your initial filing, how do you balance the timing of that versus publication, say, of a paper about your general method of using machine learning, even though it may not disclose all the details of your algorithm?
So as you probably know, Brian, I think you're asking this more for the benefit of the audience. If you've got someone who's thinking of publishing a paper like that, right, you can always take that paper and file it as a patent application. It can be the first application in kind of a series of applications. And so if you take the paper and you file it before it publishes, then you're not prior arting yourself, and that's probably the safest thing to do. And it's also one of the cheapest things to do.
How do you balance your strategy? How do you balance the strategy between patents and their other options, like your copyrights or your trade secrets?
So let's talk about trade secrets for a second, Brian. I am not a huge fan of trade secrets because, if you have a computer scientist who's making some amount of money, and it's enough to kind of keep food on the table and a roof over the head and clothes on the back, any sort of salary increase is at the margin and it's going to be significant. So if the competitor down the street offers that scientist $20,000, $30,000 a year more, that scientist is going to jump, and that information that is in the brain of the scientist is going to go with them. Now, you can take steps to try to mitigate the use of that information, but human beings aren't naturally good at sort of pigeonholing things. And if that trade secret gets out, it's a bit like a cat in a bag in your neighborhood, right? Once it's out of the bag, it's going to start killing birds. It's going to dig up flower beds. It's going to do all the stuff that cats do. And it's going to be very hard to chase down that cat and get it back in the bag. So in my mind, there's a clear difference where you only keep something a trade secret if you've analyzed it thoroughly and you've come to the conclusion that it's not something that's patentable. And everything else that is patentable, assuming your budget allows for it, you should be filing on. In terms of copyright, it's an interesting tweak with AI that you bring up, because copyright only applies to someone, the protection, who is copying someone else's work. So if Stephen King writes a book and I'm stranded on a desert island and I write the same book, but I had no access to what Stephen King wrote, then theoretically I can reproduce the same book and I can sell the same book, and the copyright that Stephen King has won't help him. And with AI, it creates an interesting situation, especially when you've got AI that's doing things like writing intelligent algorithms, because someone could have a copyright on an algorithm, but if the AI independently comes up with the same algorithm and the only thing that's protecting you is the copyright, then the AI technically, as someone who came up with it, is exempt from copyright protections that you could otherwise apply. So it brings up an interesting dilemma for those who like copyrights.
Charlie, let me ask you another question. So from my last 10 years in biopharmaceutical development and manufacturing, I've learned that there is a tremendous amount of exacting and difficult hurdles and guidances and regulatory approvals that occur in that process. It feels as if AI is still in the Wild West period. What do you think will be happening in order to standardize the regulatory approval, and what does that landscape look like for entrepreneurs in the next few to 10 years?
So it's a great question, Jeff. And you see that in multiple areas, right? Not just necessarily in AI. So for example, it used to be that people would develop a diagnostic, and that diagnostic would look at one biomarker, for example, like BRCA1, and it would tell you something. And the FDA was very comfortable with a diagnostic that looked at a single marker, right? Then people started to kind of recognize that some diseases weren't amenable, or at least currently amenable, to one or maybe two biomarkers. And so they started doing genome-wide associated studies, or GWAS studies, right? They also started multiplexing diagnostics. So maybe now you not only have a diagnostic that tells you whether you may or may not have cancer, but it'll look at 30 different types of cancer and tell you if you have one or more of those. And the FDA, in my experience, is not at all comfortable with that. I mean, pretty much anytime you ask them to step outside of something that they've already kind of grooved a path for, it creates uncertainty. And the agency wants to generally err on the side of caution when it comes to safety and efficacy. And so the uncertainty will lead to more questions. It will lead to more internal and external discussions. There will be maybe, a day or two spent with stakeholders, and ultimately a consensus will start to emerge. But it's not something, I think the agency's trying to be very responsive, but it's not something that's going to occur overnight. And so I think the answer is, twofold. One is have a, monitor the evolving state of the situation, and two, interact with the agency in whatever form, whether directly over your product or when they ask for feedback, but help shape that discussion so that you can help to maybe accelerate a pathway to getting something to market.
Great. So in the interest of time, I'll ask one last question to our panelists, and then if you have additional questions, you can email us individually or email Mary at GW or Lauren at SOPE. But to our panelists, what is it that you find is the best method of helping entrepreneurs eliminate algorithm bias when they're first starting on this venture? Karina?
What do you mean by bias?
Well, there's bias in every algorithm. What should entrepreneurs look for in order to prevent that bias or to alter that bias so that it's more inclusive and more representative?
Yeah, and that's something I tried to touch in my last slide is the data that you use to train your algorithms. That's the key portion that you need to be very careful on what data you select to use it, because its bias can be biased in terms of ethnicity. It can be biased in terms of specific device that we use to take, for example, those images. Is biased in a way that a specific clinic works. So the diversity of the data that you get in terms of, you know, where the data was taken, the equipment that was used, the personal, you know, the site, but also the patient kind of you know, background is significantly important to make sure that you have that broad diversity in all these aspects when these algorithms are trained.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that we're trying to create tools that will help physicians not only in one community or one hospital, but across the country and across the globe. And if we're creating these algorithms correctly, it should be able to help patients everywhere.
Correct.
And I can add to that, I think that one that is on the AI side of things, you have to kind of constantly look for, consciously looking for, where do I have a narrow tunnel vision and where can I add and open up to others? I can share that Jan mentioned a project that we were both involved with respect to digital strained eye. And when Jan developed the algorithms that measure the eye of the user, he noticed that there is a huge difference between the blink, the close of the eye in an Asian eye as opposed to Caucasian eye. Mm-hmm. And our AI, or the AI that Jan developed, was skewed. So then we immediately started to insert samples or subjects from a different population. Also, in another unrelated but completely different scenario that I'm involved with in a next-gen sequencing molecular biology laboratory, where we do DNA and RNA expressions on tumors and providing oncologists with feedback on how to, what's the mutation, the gene structure, and so on. You know, folks that come from different social economic even sometimes react because of the strain of pollution, if you will, or effects in life that strain their genetic composition. So we're trying to consciously, again, do the same thing, is to open the data set and to be able to enable the machine that learns from that to see more and more population. Sorry, Jan, go ahead. I think you have your hand raised.
Yes, so I actually worked quite a bit on this in finance. So it's normally not the algorithm that's biased. It's, as Karina said, it's normally the data. The trained model, where you combine the algorithm and the data, that's where the bias is. But one way in finance we worked a lot on this is by using explainable AI. With a lot of methods, you can't necessarily explain how the algorithm got to a result. And in finance, as in healthcare, you're often worried about getting sued. So we did a lot of work on explainable AI, where you can show exactly, like, because of these things, that's why the algorithm rejected your credit card offer. So that's one area to look into.
Yeah.
And Jeff, I would add one other thing, right? So I think, you know, two things were touched on, right? One was sort of diversity of data and robustness of data. The second was, you know, considering like differences in the source of data, like, you know, the eye thing we just talked about. But I think the third is, especially for startups, like getting the right consultants can be super helpful, because you can get into this sort of echo chamber where everyone starts thinking the same way within the company. And having someone step in, maybe who's outside, who's a little bit more independent, look, for example, at your algorithm, ask some questions, make some suggestions, can be super helpful and can ultimately kind of prevent you from maybe going down too narrow of a path that in the future can create problems.
No, that's a very astute observation, and you've seen a lot of entrepreneurs in your day, Charlie, so I think that our audience appreciates that. And with that, and in the interest of time, we'll conclude this webinar on the AI juggernauts in healthcare and life sciences, brought to you by the George Washington University Office of Commercialization and Technology, as well as the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs. Thank you to Mary and to Lauren for helping with the administration and the setup. Thank you to Ari and Jan and Karina and Neil, and to Brian and to Charlie and to Greenberg Trauig for being our sponsor. I hope you enjoyed. If you have other questions, please don't hesitate to call us, link in with us, and join SOPE. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.